Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today's session, part of our Global Reflection series hosted by Enstitü Sosyalin, a think tank based in Istanbul. We are committed to exploring the intersections of social, cultural, and economic challenges from a global perspective. This session marks the seventh session in our multi-webinar series of Global Reflections, where we engage with leading scholars from around the world to reflect on timely issues affecting societies today. We are honored to welcome Professor Bradford Wilcox, a distinguished sociologist and a leading voice in contemporary debates on marriage, fatherhood, and the future of the family. Dr. Wilcox is a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He also serves as the director of the Get Married initiative at the Institute for Family Studies, and he is also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His new book, Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilizations, presents a compelling case for reimagining the role of marriage and stable families in modern life. His work featured in both academic journals and major media outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Atlantic, emphasizes how strong families influence not just individuals' well-being, but also broader social stability and social well-being as well. In today's discussion, we look forward to exploring these themes across global cultural contexts. After Dr. Wilcox's presentation, we will open the floor for questions and dialogue, so please feel free to share your thoughts in the Q&A box during the section. And then I will also ask my questions. So before starting the presentation, I will ask very much general question about the marriage, well-being of the society and family, I think, which is going to cover all cases. Even the presentation is about the United States, but it is very much global case, global issue. Even today, we are living same problems in Turkey. So in today's world, not only in the West, but increasingly in developing countries, marriage is often seen as a burden. What are the true advantages, social, emotional, and economic of marriage, family, and having children? That's the key point of today's presentation, which we are very much curious about to listen. Floor is yours, Professor Wilcox. Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's great to be with the Institute and speaking about man or marriage, how to maximize happiness in life and love. But I want to begin, though, today's conversation by kind of telling the story of King Midas, the famous mythical King Midas. King Midas had a good life. He worked hard to protect his kingdom, was respected by his subjects, and loved his daughter. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't as popular, as powerful, and as rich as some other monarchs in Asia Minor. Midas wanted to stand out as a singularly successful sovereign. And then one day he got a shot at his ambition. Dionysus, the god of wine, offered Midas one wish. I want everything that I touch to turn to gold, said King Midas. Are you sure, Midas, said Dionysus? This could end badly. But Midas answered in the affirmative. He got his wish. He walked about his kingdom, turning everything that he could into gold. At first, he was gleeful, thinking of all the ways that riches and glory would come to him. Midas started to daydream about his ambitious agenda to take his kingdom into the 21st century, and the New York Times profile and multi-million follower count on Insta that would follow. But when Midas returned to his castle, he was in for some surprises. He tried to have a meal, but everything that he ate turned to gold. This got him worried. And unbeknownst to him, his daughter came up behind him to give him a kiss. And before he could warn her, she kissed him and was also turned into gold. Midas, at this point, realized that he had made a grave mistake. His beloved had been turned into a rock. Despair filled his heart. This power he had sought with such a singular focus, Midas realized was not a blessing, but a curse. Again, not a blessing, but a curse. So I think that this ancient fable could not be more relevant for our day, not just in the US, but also in Turkey and across much of the world. because the new elite messaging that we're getting, often online and in the media and in the academy or universities about work and freedom and family, is advancing a kind of Midas mindset. This Midas mindset discounts the importance of marriage and family. Forging a happy life, we're told, is to be found in a rewarding career, in money, and in freedom from the encumbrances of family life. The message then is that mammon is much more important than marriage when it comes to our culture today. Again, this is kind of the Midas mindset. And this Midas mindset was articulated for me, for instance, when I came across this headline trending across Twitter one night when I was finishing up my book, Get Married. And this headline said that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, kind of suggesting that the path to prosperity runs away from family for women and not towards family for women. More importantly, this article in Bloomberg, one of our leading financial news services, also kind of presented one single and childless woman after another who were kind of living their best life emotionally, suggesting implicitly that the path not just to prosperity, but also to happiness ran away from family and towards, the single and childless lifestyle. Or in the words of one of the women who was profiled in this Bloomberg story, Ashley, who has properties in New York City and what's called the Jersey Shore, and has a lot of time and money for travel and other kinds of enriching experiences, having neither a spouse nor kids. From her perspective, quote, "I love my life and feel very fulfilled," is what Ashley said about this single and childless lifestyle. But again, it's emblematic of the way in which oftentimes the mainstream media is sort of depicting the whole idea of mammon being more valuable than marriage. We have here also another example of The Atlantic making the case against marriage in an earlier article. We have the New York Times, for instance, making the case against married motherhood in a recent op-ed by Amy Shern. So what we're seeing, I think, particularly from the left, is kind of this idea that marriage and family life are a bad deal for women. And this has been a message we've gotten for a long time from different precincts, different places on the left, both in the mainstream media and then in universities and colleges as well. But of course, what's new about this moment is we're now getting kind of an anti-marriage message targeting men, but not from the left, but rather from what's called the red pill right, or the online manosphere. Looking here at Andrew Tate on the right and Pearl Davis on the left, who are prominent proponents of the idea that marriage is bad for men. They have this idea, for instance, that there is zero advantage to marriage in the Western world for a man. And that's because they think men are not given enough deference, not enough submission in marriage, and also because they think that most marriages end in divorce today for men. So their takeaway here basically is that men should be steering clear of marriage and instead focus on getting strong, making lots of money, and living a life unencumbered by, again, marriage and family. So from the left then and from the right, we're kind of getting the idea that the path to a meaningful and happy life runs away from family. And this message is certainly resonating with a lot of young adults today, both that I deal with in the United States, but of course, we're seeing this globally play out as well. One student of mine, for instance, at UVA, a woman named Holly, a recent graduate of the University of Virginia, kind of had this to say in sort of the spirit of articulating the Midas mindset. She said, UVA students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their careers started than getting into a serious relationship. If it happens, great. But the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. The thought process is relationships and love are a risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on, at least while you are young. Okay, so this is kind of an example of how this Midas mindset is articulated from one recent graduate of my own university, but it's very common for young adults more generally. We have a very good survey program in the United States called the Pew Research Center, And they're finding in survey after survey that adults, particularly younger adults, are kind of telling their survey askers that a job or career is more important than getting married and having kids. You kind of can see that here on this poll. About 86% of young adults would deem a job as very important for fulfillment, and only about 36 would say getting married, and 30% having kids would be important for fulfillment. So this is kind of an example of how this Midas mindset is being expressed in popular opinion as well among younger adults in the US. But what does the data tell us about, for instance, kind of the pursuit of happiness? Is it the case that the Midas mindset, the pathway sort of stressing education and work, is a more profitable path than marriage and family? And while it's true when we look at the data in the US that education, work, and money matter for happiness, we also see that nothing compares to marriage, especially a good marriage, when it comes to predicting happiness in the United States. And I've seen this with my work in what's called the General Social Survey. I'm working with Dr. Wendy Wang, my colleague. What we find is that, yes, more education, orange here, more income in yellow here, and a satisfying career in red here predict more happiness for ordinary American adults, for women and men. But that simply being married here in blue is more predictive of happiness for ordinary adults in the US, and that having a happy marriage here in green is a lot more predictive of happiness than these more Midas mindset related factors like education and money and career. In fact, there's no variable in this data set, again, it's called the General Social Survey, that predicts happiness for adults better than the quality of one's relationship, one's marriage. So it's just kind of a reminder that what matters for us is more our social relationships than things like work and other markers of status. And that makes sense because Aristotle reminded us many, many years ago that man is by nature a social animal. And what I think this means is that our ties with others, with friends, and especially family, end up giving us more meaning, direction, and a sense of solidarity than factors like money and work and education. Because these social ties that give us so many opportunities both to receive care and concern from others, but also, and as importantly, to extend care and concern towards others. And again, it's these social ties that lend our lives the most meaning, purpose, and happiness, not the degree on our wall or the money on our bank account. So from my perspective, the Midas curse that's playing out, not just actually here in the US, but globally, we're seeing declines in marriage and fertility also in Turkey, as you well know, but in many countries across the globe, is that too few Americans and too few global citizens are either able to get married and start families in terms of being able to afford doing that, or they're no longer even kind of, prioritizing getting married and having a family because they've kind of bought into this Midas mindset. And it's one reason I think we're seeing, at least in the States, happiness kind of falling to record lows. The research actually tells us that the number one factor, this is from a recent University of Chicago study, explaining declines in happiness in America is the fact that fewer Americans are married. So this is kind of the Midas curse. And I see this in talking to ordinary young adults across the US. In my book, for instance, I talk about Scott, who has done well on the Midas front. He's got a graduate degree, he's got a good job, he makes more than $100,000. But these professional accomplishments, consistent with the Midas mindset, are not enough for him. He says, I've got degrees in my wall, I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he told me. It's not like I can take any of that with me after I die. But I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize I'm alone. I have nobody. So his kind of sense of loneliness and meaninglessness is kind of driving a pervasive sadness in Scott's life that's emblematic of the way in which, of course, not all singles, but many more singles than married adults are experiencing in America today. And so what's happening though, when we kind of look at the trends, is that there are more and more Americans, this is true also, this kind of trend is true in Turkey as well, who are not getting married. And so we've seen the marriage rate in the US, for instance, fall about 60% since 1970. And what this means in the US, at least, is that a record share of young adults are projected to never marry. 1 in 3 young Americans, which is a record for us. Again, this, helps to explain more than any other factor why we're seeing reports of happiness come down in the US, as this new study from the University of Chicago suggests, as noted here on the screen. So this is the bad news that I'm conveying to you this evening here in this presentation. Is there any good news to report about all of this? Well, there is some good news to report, and that is that some, Americans are forging happy and stable marriages in our country today. And I think probably lessons that we're learning from their experience might be applicable in some important ways too to Turkey and to other countries across the globe as well. And so there are 4 groups in the US who are doing particularly well when it comes to forging strong, intact families. These groups are Asian Americans, conservative Americans, religious or faithful Americans, and then what I call strivers or college-educated Americans who kind of prioritize forward thinking and working hard in school and at the workplace as well. And they generally also are reporting more meaningful and happy lives because of the fact, in part, that they are more likely to be married with kids. So what is their secret? Well, I will say one thing that they're doing is kind of often defying more progressive or individualistic ideas and norms that they're encountering from the mainstream media or from online social media platforms in favor of more familistic ideas and values and norms. And I will just mention kind of 3 pillars right now for my presentation that I see kind of exemplified in their marriages typically, that sort of undergird and keep their marriages strong and stable. And those 3 pillars are what I call communion, what I would describe as commitment, and what I also would kind of reference in terms of community. So when it comes to communion, for instance, it's important to note here that the successful married Americans often are rejecting a kind of more me-first mentality that our elites are often articulating, that would want us to kind of privilege autonomy and freedom and self-interest in our relationships and in our marriages in particular. For example, when it comes to money, what we see is that many financial professionals and journalists would encourage us to keep separate accounts, his account and her account. Susie Orman, who's a very famous financial guru in the States, talks about having your own nest egg, in case your marriage ends. Okay, so again, this is all part and parcel of a larger, more individualistic, me-first approach to marriage, in this case, when it comes to money. But as I spoke to ordinary couples like John and Maria Erickson, a military couple that I talked to for my book, what I found was that they had a rather different experience. In their case, when they were first engaged, they were preparing to head out on a military deployment. And Maria went to the store to get some expensive items, including ballistic glasses. And she came back with these items, and she expected at that point in time, John to pay her back. But John just kissed her on the forehead and said to her, "What is yours is mine, and mine is yours. And now we're going to be married. It's all going to be equal." And this was kind of surprising for Maria because she'd come from a family where her mom and dad had separate accounts. But John was anticipating joint accounts as they moved into marriage. And actually taking this step benefited Maria because she brought a lot of debt from her graduate education into their marriage. And John brought no debt into their marriage. And so by joining their income together once they were married, having shared accounts, led them to pay off her debt very quickly and kind of establish a pattern of mutuality and trust and a dependency upon one another that's guided their marriage for more than 25 years as a married couple with a couple of kids as well, successfully. And what we see in the research is that this couple is no outlier. A survey we did with YouGov found that couples who have shared accounts are happier. That's the lighter yellow bar at the top here. And they're less likely to be worrying about divorce. That's the bar kind of in the middle of this presentation. And we also have experimental evidence too from Indiana University telling us that couples who randomly assigned to joint accounts did better in their marriages than couples who are randomly assigned to separate accounts. So the bigger point here is that couples who take a we before me approach to marriage that's predicated on forging a sense of unity and teamwork and mutual service are more likely to flourish by cultivating, in a sense, this more communion-oriented approach to their marriages. This more collective approach, a more familistic approach, are more likely to be flourishing on a number of different fronts. But I'm giving you the example from just kind of cultivating communion financially in marriage is one example of this. So what about commitment? The second pillar that I mentioned. Again, our elites are often, I think, in the name of choice and individualism today, discouraging values like marital permanence and sexual fidelity and even monogamy. You've probably noticed, at least if you've been following American media outlets, that in the last year or so, there's been a lot of talk about what we call polyamory here in the US. The New York Times, for instance, had an article on how a, quote, polyamorous mom had a big sexual adventure and found herself, and kind of painted a glowing portrait of this woman who lives in New York City, who's married and has relationships with other men, though, outside of her marriage, as does her husband. This is all kind of depicted as a very good thing by the New York Times, okay? And it's an example of how our elites are kind of discounting the importance, in this case, of fidelity and monogamy. But as I spoke to ordinary Americans who were married, I had a sense of people who...
Professor Wilcox, this is very much, let's say, the marginal case, yeah, for the New York City.
Well, we have seen kind of a lot of media outlets, you know, the New York Times, New York Magazine, the Wall Street Journal. There's a new television show called From Couple to Throuple, who are kind of promoting this polyamorous lifestyle. And we have seen, in terms of just attitudes towards fidelity, come down pretty markedly among more liberal Americans since around 2010. And I think it's because this idea has been promoted by a number of, you know, media and other kinds of outlets. So it's still, you know, it's a minority pattern, but of course, you know, as with many other, you know, family developments in the last few decades here in the US, what can seem to be like a very marginal or very, you know, unusual pattern, you know, if it's promoted enough, can become, you know, much more common. So that's the
I
sort
think
of...
that's the, yeah, absolutely. That's the key point, because the media is promoting, but in the reality, it is very much marginal. And also, I think that will be good to discuss about woke culture as well, which is very much debated in the American media as well. So, yeah, thank you, by the way.
Yes, you're welcome. So what I found, though, in speaking to ordinary couples, is that husbands and wives who are kind of deliberate about having a certain kind of, you know, fence around their marriage, both, you know, practically and virtually, were more likely to be flourishing. I profile a guy named Patrick in the book, who is, you know, tall, handsome, successful. He travels a lot for his work. And these are things that could boost his risk of infidelity. But he's intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. Quote, "When I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I am a family man," is the language he gave. He also has rules governing his online interactions. "My wife is tagged in a majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I do not follow old girlfriends online, as there's a reason that they're in that category," is what he said to me. So it's probably no accident that Patrick's wife, Kelly, gave their marriage a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the best rating. Again, I think what she perceives accurately is that her husband, you know, prioritizes her and their marriage, and acts in a way, both again, virtually and in person, to kind of honor his commitment to her. And we do see that Americans who embrace the more classic view, here in yellow, that any sex outside of marriage is wrong, are happier in their marriages than Americans who take the newer view, which, as I mentioned before, has become more common since about 2010, particularly among more liberal adults in the US. And then we see kind of more generally that when it comes to commitment, different measures of commitment that are studied by scholars are often, some of the best predictors of marital quality. Just, again, having the sense that your spouse is committed to you, to your marriage, and to your well-being. These are all kind of important factors that tend to generate higher quality marriages in the research that I've seen in the US. And then finally, community. And again, I think the elite view often is that one kind of community, especially religious community, is an obstacle to kind of progress, embracing the world as it is today, to kind of living your best life and realizing your best love. This came through, for instance, in a recent New Yorker interview with a sociologist named Sam Perry, and they were talking about evangelical Protestant Christians and how evangelical Protestant Christian men were struggling with pornography oftentimes, and their wives were not happy with this whole issue of pornography, and there were, many problems kind of depicted in connection with the intersection between having a more traditional faith and struggling, for these guys with their religious concerns about using pornography. But the basic takeaway, I think, from this interview was that religion was an obstacle to forging a strong and stable marriage. And yet, when I spoke to ordinary couples across the US, I had this sense that the story actually ran in the opposite direction. So I spoke to a couple, an African-American Christian couple living outside of DC, for instance, and Martin talked about how his faith led him to be careful on the internet. When it came to looking at his favorite news and music sites, he said, quote, it's one of those things where, the Bible is very clear about fleeing temptation, he said, adding, so yeah, certain sites I won't go on. And then his wife, Kimberly, mentioned that she had actually suffered abuse, child sexual abuse, and that had made physical intimacy initially difficult for her. But through the power of prayer, she was able to work through that. She said, but that's how prayer entered, because I had some stuff happen prior to us that made having sex challenging. I'm like, okay, God, you're only going to heal me. Only God can really, truly heal this. And their story is, again, not an outlier. What we see in the research that I did here in the United States is that religious couples are generally happier than more secular couples. Of course, there are exceptions, obviously, but on average, we can see the pattern here. We also see when it comes to divorce, from Harvard professor Tyler Vanderweel, that women who attend church regularly are less likely to get divorced, about 47% less likely to get divorced. We also can see, and this is, I think, surprising in light of the New Yorker article, that today in America, there's a gap in sexual frequency where religious couples are much more likely to have sex than secular couples. And this is also, I should say, a new gap. There was no gap in 2000, but this gap has been emerging across different data sets. So something about religion, at least in this newer context, seems to facilitate more physical intimacy for couples, and then also greater sexual satisfaction. As I think about kind of the more general relationship between religion and marriage, including here the sort of more typical pattern when it comes to physical intimacy, what I think is happening is that the kind of family first values, virtues like fidelity and forgiveness, and the social networks embodied in religious communities are ones that typically tend to strengthen and stabilize marriage and family life here in the US. And I would suspect that's true in other countries as well. So we see in the US is that the happiest Americans tend to be ones who are what I call the masters of marriage, Americans who are experiencing strong and stable marriages. and especially religious Americans, conservative Americans, and more educated Americans would kind of fall into this greater trend in terms of being happy, and also reporting a more meaningful life. So again, go ahead.
Professor Wilcox, I am also very much curious about the trend of secularism in secularization of the society in the US, because if you look at the data, and there's a clear that birth rate is decreasing, marriage is also decreasing, but at the same time, there's a good data about the US society, because divorce rate is also decreasing in comparing to last decade. So there are different dynamics and data about the US society. Can we also discuss that developments in the context of the religion and secularization?
So when it comes to religion, what we're seeing in the United States is that really since the late 1960s, up until recently, there's been a decline in American religiosity. But we are seeing evidence that that decline has leveled off, and that there may be an upswing in religion now, both in terms of just attendance across the board, but also we're seeing evidence that what we call Generation Z, that's our youngest generation, is more religious than millennials, which is the next youngest generation. So the general trajectory from the late 60s until recently has been towards more secularity, less religiosity in the US. But in the most recent cohort, and especially among younger men, we are seeing signs of a religious upswing, or a certain kind of revival of sorts, which, if it continues, could also help to revive the fortunes of marriage. So marriage has come down, as I mentioned before, in part, I think, because we are a more secular society. And so if religion ticks upward on a kind of continuing basis, that then I think might lead to an upswing in the marriage rate. But because marriage has become more selective for people who are relatively more religious, more conservative, or more educated and affluent, that also means that marriage is more stable, and family life is more stable in the US now than it was a decade ago or 15 years ago. So while from the 60s again to about 2010, we saw a decline in married parent families, more and more kids living in single parent families, for instance. Since about 2012, we're seeing an increase in the share of kids living in married parent stable families, in part, I think, because family life has become more selective again for being religious or being conservative or being more educated and affluent. But just to kind of return to the opening theme, I want to just basically say that even though many people today in the US and across the globe think that the kind of path to a meaningful and happy life runs away from marriage and family, what we see, at least based upon the US data, is that the folks in America who are the happiest are Americans who are married parents, who are married mothers, and married fathers, especially Americans who are religious. They're the happiest Americans, and living the lives that are most kind of family and community centered, obviously, as well. And so even though our elite institutions have been kind of devoted to a more Midas mindset, to its materialism, to its individualism, to its careerism, I think given the kind of evidence that I've discussed this evening with you, we need to kind of rediscover a marriage mindset in terms of what we're teaching in our schools and our religious institutions, our homes, what we're discussing on social media, and also, of course, what we're talking about in our colleges and universities. Because from my perspective, obviously, what matters most is not mammon or not the Midas mindset, but instead it's love and marriage. So with that, I'm happy to kind of entertain more questions you might have about my presentation this evening for you, as well as the book more generally. And then just to mention too, that I'm on Twitter at Bradford Wilcox IFS, and I'm a fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, which does a lot of work on fertility and marriage and parenthood that might be of interest to your audience. And so I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Wilcox. I think that will be good to discuss with. I have several questions. Then we can go with the audience questions. So please write your questions to message box, then I can read through that. My question is about indeed marriage rates in the US have remained very much stable last 10 years. That also I asked in my last question. And also divorce rates have declined. What do you think the main driving force behind all these developments? At the same time, I want to ask about the birth rate, because right now all states policymakers are very much obsessive with the birth rates, and they are trying to increase the birth rate, and they are declaring some certain policies to support the families for it. But they, as far as I understand, they do not care about the marriage, family, the content of the process. So in the United States, for instance, birth rate last 5 years very much stable, around the 1.6. So what practical strategies might policymakers or civil society adopt to encourage this birth rate process?
Yeah, so in terms of the first question, again, the marriage rates come down by about 60% since 1970, although that decline, as you noted, has slowed in recent years. But I think one of the challenges we have there is trying to also acknowledge that, you know, some of the folks who are getting married, say, for the second or the third time. And so when you look at, you know, the age-adjusted marriage rate, we still kind of continue to see decline in recent years in the US. But again, that's coupled with declines in divorce. So the folks who are getting married today are forging more stable marriages than was the case, you know, back in the 1970s and early 1980s in the US. The divorce rate's down 40% since 1980. And so this is just one more way in which the kinds of people who are getting married today are a bit distinctive, like I mentioned in my presentation. And those distinctives in terms of being more religious or more conservative or more, you know, affluent or educated are all factors that are associated with greater stability in marriage. And so it's a kind of a good news, bad news story for the family in the US. The bad news, I think, is that fewer adults are able to kind of enter into marriage and enjoy the benefits of marriage. It's a good news story in the sense that the kids who are being born into families today are more likely to be raised by stably married parent families than was the case 10 or 20 years ago. In terms of fertility, we have seen a decline from about 2.1 babies per month on average in 2009 to about 1.6, as you mentioned, currently. And this has begun to generate interest in the US in kind of more, we call pro-natalist policies. And there are some, like Elon Musk, who would sort of advocate for babies apart from marriage. But Lyman Stone and I, my colleague at the Institute for Family Studies, have a piece in The Atlantic today, kind of critiquing Elon Musk. And we argue that the problem with kind of the Musk approach is it doesn't appreciate the ways in which, especially kids, are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of being raised by their own married parents, you know, in a stable married parent family. So we would like to see policies that promote both marriage and parenthood. And, you know, we would support more generous, for instance, child tax credits that would give more cash to families for the kids that they have. I think what France has done for actually many years is also very smart. They have a kind of a diminished tax rate for families with more kids. So in France, your tax rate is determined not just by the number of adults, you know, 1 or 2 adults in the household, but also by the number of kids that you have in the household. And so again, in France, your tax rate goes down, even if you're more affluent, if you have more children in the home. So these are the kinds of, you know, policy levers that we can pull, I think, to help make family life more either attractive or affordable. But it's also clear from the research on international family policies that discrete, you know, child allowances or discrete tax benefits often have only a very modest effect on birth rates. And so we also need to be thinking about kind of just the culture and help people prioritize what we call a familistic mindset, outlook, and to help people understand that there are lots of things about family life that are associated with greater meaning and happiness. I'll just give you one concrete example of the kind of, we think, kind of evidence that would be helpful in the public discussion is we've just done new research on women and happiness in America. And we find that married moms are happier in the US in part because they have more experiences of physical touch throughout the day, more kissing, more hugging, more snuggling with either a spouse or children, and that these reports of physical touch help to mediate the relationship between their family status and their happiness. So it's just an example of the way in which I think we've kind of haven't appreciated enough how much, again, both friendships and family relationships are important for our well-being. And again, just one example of this is the value and the power of physical touch.
Professor Wilcox, I think that's the key point of your research when I was reading, because as I mentioned, most of the policymakers are supporting pro-natalist policies, and Elon Musk is a role model, by the way. He is supporting the having kids without family as well, but it causes lots of problems, which is, I think, critical to understand this development as well. And the family life should also should be understand through all these dynamics and research. And there are several questions which I'm going to read. One of them, Enes Sayın, I have a few questions regarding the cultural factors behind the decrease in marriage and fertility. First, how can cultural factors be measured? Of the discourse, especially Twitter, it is easy to think progressive political discourse discourages marriage and child rearing. This discourse is popular in Turkish social media as well, and it boils down to a certain framing of sex war between men and women. So there are different kind of, as you know, propaganda in social media and the media regarding the gender roles as well, marriage. What do you think about the gender roles and the marriage and the sex tendencies regarding this development?
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point about kind of the ideological character of the commentary about marriage and family. And again, we do hear from a lot of more progressive voices, critiques of marriage and sort of celebrations of single life, and also kind of this idea that marriage and family life are more oppressive for women. And this is why we should kind of be steering clear of marriage and family, particularly if, from a kind of more female-based perspective. I think, and again, I'm speaking from the US perspective, what they don't acknowledge, though, is that in the United States, we still see that married mothers aged, in our analysis, 18 to 55, are the happiest women. Now, we also show in our work that they sleep less, they're more stressed out, they report more sacrifices for others. So all the things that we would expect, right, in terms of the critiques of marriage and motherhood. What the critiques don't acknowledge, though, is that in spite of these sacrifices and difficulties that moms experience, oftentimes, moms also, married moms especially, report, again, more meaning, more happiness, also in our new research, more touch, physical touch, and that these things kind of, I would say, make the experience of family life generally better for women than the experience of not having a family. But it's also the case, too, when it comes to my own work on happiness in marriage, that a husband's engagement practically and emotionally with his wife and children is a huge predictor of her happiness with the marriage. Doesn't mean they have to do everything on a 50-50 basis. It just means that when the husband is, at home, he needs to be kind of present to his wife and children. And I think one reason we've seen just a tremendous decline in family formation, especially in East Asia, is that there are cultural contexts, like in South Korea and Japan, where men are spending long hours in the workplace. And then when they come home, there's not really a norm of the man kind of really engaging with the family. And so I think if we want to kind of turn a corner here in a more pro-family direction, we need to be kind of thinking about new ways to kind of encourage men to prioritize the well-being of their wives and their kids, both emotionally and practically, when they're at home with their families. So that's, I think, one way to address particularly more a feminist or progressive critique of marriage and family life that has a lot of salience, both in the US and I think across the globe. So again, I think go ahead.
Yeah, that's good to discuss about Far Asia developments, and there is a question about it. And Mr. Fatih Öge, he is working with the Istanbul Family Foundation, and he's very much thankful for your presentation. And he asked, how do you comment on the South Korean example of increasing birth rates? That is the fact that no matter how much money you spend, you cannot encourage people to have a stable marriage and have more than one child. In addition to material motivations such as money, shelter, and lower taxes, are there also spiritual motivations needed? That's the question. By the way, I do want to ask, that's the spiritual way of the question. And my question is about the political developments from the 1990s, because all the international media promoted liberal perspective and woke culture after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And it also promoted the living alone, which also ended up with the highly, in Turkey it increased to 20% living alone. In the United States, I think it is more than 30%. So there is also political motivations behind all this promotion to individualistic life. So what do you think about both questions, both the political, let's say, the motivations, and the how to support this process through the spiritual way?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges facing us is that really since the rise of these devices, we have, a new kind of set of social media messaging and ideas and norms that are being disseminated at scale. And particularly when it comes to sort of younger women have been exposed to many more individualistic and anti-family messages, and just more progressive messages too about life and relationships and gender, that have pushed young women to the left. And then meanwhile, we're now seeing too that, plenty of young men are being exposed to more misogynistic messaging, like people like Andrew Tate is what I mentioned, for instance, as one example of that. And so what's happened is that social media has been a force for dividing the sexes, women going left, men going right, young men, going right, young men going left. And that makes it even harder for them to date, to mate, and marry. So this is one of the challenges, facing us. And per your question about kind of the woke turn, in the last really decade, that's been driven obviously a lot by social media platforms that have encouraged more individualistic and more anti-family, ideas and messages and practices or traditions or customs. So this is one reason why I think we have seen a decline in dating and family formation as well. In terms of the South Korean point, that's certainly those dynamics have played out in South Korea. Ideologically, women have moved to the left, men to the right. Another issue in South Korea is that men have been doing relatively worse when it came to school, certainly, and to some extent the labor force, and women doing relatively better. And so men have less to bring to romantic and family, lives than they did in an earlier era, which also makes it harder for people to date and marry as well. And then, yes,
that's exactly Midas curse, which you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation.
Yes, that's right. And in terms of just to be clear, I think a certain degree of financial stability is important for people to go ahead and enter into marriage and family life, especially what we see in the research is that when the man is doing reasonably well when it comes to work, that predicts both getting married in the first place and staying married in the second place in the US data. But an excessive focus on work and money is kind of contrary to kind of, basically investing in family life. And then religiously, yeah, I mean, I think, what we see in the United States, I'm sure this is true in Turkey as well, is that there's about a 0.5 difference in the TFR for 40-something women, where more religious women are about 2.3 in their 40s, and more secular women are about, 1.6, 1.5, depending upon the data set. But it's just kind of an example of the way in which religious communities that prioritize parenthood, that give honor to fathers, and especially to mothers, who also kind of can make sense of the sacrifices that, flow from having children, are more likely to, to be encouraging parenthood and childbearing, whereas secular communities are more likely to have lower fertility rates for obvious reasons. But I want to have one quick caveat to all this, and that is I think there is a growing recognition on the part of more progressive elites here in the United States that maybe they've gone too far when it comes to marriage and parenthood, because if they don't kind of change their orientation to family life, they're going to lose out demographically.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen in Israel, for instance, that Israel has gone from being more, politically liberal 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever, to being much more culturally and politically conservative now. And that's in part because demographically in Israel, the groups who have, grown family-wise are much more conservative, both politically and religiously. So, if you minimize the importance of family for too long over time, your community is going to lose out compared to communities that elevate family, in their intergenerational relationships.
Mm-hmm. So based on your research, so there are differences between the social classes, elites and the ordinary people, or the different cultures, as you mentioned about Israel, the conservative families, the more secular families. So basically, has your research identified significant cultural differences in how marriage contributes to happiness across different societies?
So I've seen research on terms of the link between marriage and happiness in the United States and in Europe, especially in the UK. I have not seen kind of really on the question of happiness, just to be clear and honest, I haven't seen kind of really evidence on this score in, say, East Asia, for instance, and that would be something, to look at. I don't know about the data in Turkey either, in particular as well.
Okay, thank you. And another question. So what micro level mechanisms do you think enable the positive effects of religious participation on marriage and sexuality? How can these mechanisms, such as belonging, routine, collective norms, be operationalized in a secular context? Is it possible to integrate such micro level structures into fertility policies?
So I think what's happening is, I mentioned in 2000, we have good data telling us that there was no gap between religious and secular couples in the US when it came to sexual frequency, whereas there is a gap now across two different data sets. I think what's happening in the United States context, and it's probably relevant for Turkey as well, is that I think religious couples are more likely to have a certain degree of asceticism when it comes to technology. And what I mean by that is like more of like a habit of trying to kind of not be on the screen all the time. Like you put the phone in a box, in the kitchen, and you leave it there, And so if you're ascetical, if you deny your desire to be on your device, it creates more opportunities to talk with your spouse, to engage your spouse, and then also to have physical intimacy as well. I think the other kind of piece here too is that for all of the kind of difficulties religious people may have in kind of steering clear of pornography, they still do that more successfully than secular couples do, at least in the US data. And so I think kind of, steering clear of pornography kind of just makes one more likely to focus on real sex in real life as well. And then thirdly, I think that religious couples are more likely to try to foster an ethic of generosity in their marriages. And we see is that in most couples, husbands are more likely to, desire physical intimacy on a more regular basis than wives. So I think with religious couples, what I see in the data in the US anyways, is that the religious husbands are more likely to understand their wives don't want to have sex at certain times and just to respect that. At the same time, though, the wives are more likely to understand that their husbands are prioritizing in some way, having regular physical intimacy, and just to be generous in that regard. And so just they find common ground, if you will. They give a little bit, and that leads to more physical intimacy. So that's, I think, part of the story there. And then I would just say more generally when it comes to religion and marriage in terms of the norms and practices, that just sort of having a habit of praying with and for your spouse and family helps, I think, people to recalibrate their behavior within the family to become more patient, more forgiving, more considerate, for men to contain their anger, control their anger, wives to be, more flexible with their husbands, and that's obviously all to the good of those families. Now, secular equivalents, I think we could imagine, schools and counselors also kind of equipping people with, virtues related to communication, for instance, in conflict, and reinforcing the value of commitment in more generic family-friendly ways that are not specifically rooted in religious teachings would be kind of, I think, the secular equivalence of what we often see in a religious context.
Thank you for the explanation for it. By the way, my background is political science and international relations. So when we compare the countries and their strengths or the weakness, mostly we are focusing on the military power, economic power, or this kind of social capital, economic capital. But at the same time, today, I think the biggest strength or the weakness of the countries is the society, families. So how do you interpret these dynamics in comparing with the different developments across the world?
Well, I mean, I think that, obviously there are many ways in which sort of family life is intersecting with both international relations and with economic trends internationally that we're all paying attention to. I mean, I think demographically, we're all aware of the ways in which, market declines in fertility are affecting the long-term welfare of, for instance, the Chinese economy and the South Korean and Japanese economies as well. I mean, we're kind of projecting an important measure of stagnation in those economies just because of dramatic declines in fertility. But I think it's also the case, too, that people's kind of capacity to flourish in a variety of different ways is predicated upon having a good family life. And so there could be ways in which, too, people who are what they call in China bare branches, and these are people who have no kin, for instance, in China, they might be more susceptible to, populist or demagogic political appeals if they don't have a strong, family context. So what I'm just saying is that you can imagine how kind of the breakdown or the loss of centrality for the family could lead people to depend more on the state and or political parties, rather than on their kin, and in ways that, would be suboptimal at the national context.
Thank you. And also, we hosted here Professor Martin K. White from Harvard University, and he also mentioned about the Chinese developments, and he identified as a be careful what you wish for regarding the one-child policy. So that's clear that the states and ideologies of some political parties across the world means the real influence of these policies, individualism or the promotion to individualist family or anti-family propaganda, as you mentioned in the Western media. So these developments harm the family life very much. And there are other questions which I want to also ask. Senanur Atmaca, my question is about reflections of mom figures on social media. Momstagram, mom talk, terms for the moms on social media who shares their happily and idealistic family life on Instagram, TikTok. Do these representations positively influence the perception of family life, particularly among the Generation Z and population?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's no question that social media is obviously enormously important, and I'm happy that there are certainly plenty of social media figures and influencers who are trying to kind of project a more positive image of motherhood online. I think the problem though with some of these influencers is that they depict an unrealistically beautiful and happy home life. Probably the most famous one we see nowadays is Ballerina Farm, this mother of 8 children in Utah who runs this incredibly, powerful farm, and they produce beautiful food, and everything is just almost seemingly perfect. And I think the reality for those of us who are married, I'm a married father, sometimes things are beautiful, obviously, and wonderful in the home, and sometimes they're messy and chaotic and and difficult in the home. And so I think the challenge is on social media is to kind of to be looking for voices, be they say mothers or fathers, who are depicting a generally positive, or offering a positive message or example, but also kind of being frank about the difficulties and the challenges. And there's one couple that I know, for instance, who do a lot of work online, and they'll do things by like just sort of showing like a messy room in their house and talking about how their kids are, doing poorly in some, way. And then they'll just kind of humorously, just say, look, this is life, this is family, this is the messiness of it. And then pivot to kind of talking about some good things. But they're just very honest about sort of saying, to their online audience that, yes, being a wife, being a husband, being a father, being a mother are great things, but it's not like one uninterrupted, a high moment after another.
Thank you. And also, as the Institute Social, we are also conducting research about the society and families, and we saw that there is also a gap at the break between the generations. So in Turkey, and because of the social media, because of the technological developments, is it same case for the United States as well?
Yeah, but it's getting complicated. So I think, again, particularly around 2012, 2014, we did see a lot of younger adults kind of moving in new cultural directions, particularly younger women, like we talked about earlier on the session this evening with you. But we're seeing yet another turn right now with younger adults, like in their late teens and early 20s, that seems to be potentially more family friendly. I mean, it's too early to tell here, but I think sometimes with these cultural currents, they can kind of shift in one direction and then shift in yet another direction. So what I think might happen in Turkey is that you might see among younger adults, a turn away from a more familistic orientation potentially in Turkey, but then with the next cohort, some kind of swing back towards family. It's not going to be like the family model in Turkey from, the 1990s or 80s, but, it could be kind of a more familistic orientation towards forging kind of a contemporary family life in Turkey that the younger adults who are now like in their late teens, for instance, might take up as against the millennial pattern in Turkey, potentially.
Thank you very much, by the way. And also we came to, indeed, we passed 10 minutes to our time limit, but I really enjoyed and learned from this conversation. It's very much beneficial for me and informative. Thank you very much again for joining us and contributing our Global Reflection series. And we would be very much happy to host you in Istanbul as well.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with the Institute this evening, and I hope that my travels do take me to Turkey at some point. That'd be great.
Hopefully. Have a good day. And there are some questions as well, but at the same time, I think we covered most of them. And hopefully they are going to read your books and articles. They can see the answers from there. Thank you very much again. Have a good
Okay.
day.
Thank
Bye.
you.